The rain hammered against the glass of the Skyview Grand Hotel, a relentless driving force that turned the city outside into a blurred gray smear. Inside, the lobby felt like a tomb. Water tracked across the marble floor from the heavy entrance doors, pooling near the base of the pillars. Michael Jordan stood near the threshold, his gaze sweeping across the cavernous room. The air was stagnant, carrying the faint, sharp scent of damp carpet and neglected dust. He watched a bellhop struggle with a cart, the wheels screeching against the floor as the frame buckled under a load that should have been light. A concierge leaned heavily against a marble column, his eyes fixed on a glowing screen, ignoring the few guests drifting toward the elevators. Every shadow in the room seemed to deepen the sense of rot. This was not the premier destination he had invested in. It was a hollowed-out shell. Michael tightened his grip on the handle of his suitcase, his knuckles white. The storm outside was loud, but the silence inside was heavier, pressing down with the weight of deliberate mismanagement. He took a slow, measured step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the stone. He moved toward the counter, his presence cutting through the gloom like a blade. Michael stopped directly in front of the reception desk. He waited. Eliza Thornton sat behind the polished mahogany, her gaze locked onto the glowing monitor. Her fingers moved in a steady, rhythmic clatter against the keys, a sharp sound that echoed in the cavernous lobby. She did not look up. She did not pause. She adjusted her posture, shifting her weight, but her eyes remained fixed on the data scrolling across the screen. Michael watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking. He leaned forward, his shadow falling across her workspace. Yet she continued to type, her expression a mask of practiced indifference. It was a calculated silence, a wall built of indifference intended to make him feel small. He stood motionless, his presence filling the space between them. The air grew thin, charged with the friction of his patience wearing down. He did not tap his fingers, he did not clear his throat, he simply existed in her periphery. Finally, he placed his hand flat on the desk, the sound of his palm hitting the wood sharp enough to make a nearby concierge flinch. Eliza stopped typing. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her fingers hovering over the keys, and finally shifted her gaze upward. Her expression was tight, her eyes cold. Michael ignored the clerk's cold stare and turned his attention to the lobby. The grand space, once a beacon of Chicago luxury, now felt like a hollowed-out relic. He looked down at the floor. The carpet, which should have been plush and pristine, was worn thin, its edges frayed and matted with dirt. He traced the path of a bellhop, dragging a heavy, rusted cart across the floor, the metal scraping against the marble with a jarring, uneven sound. It was a careless, grinding noise that spoke of total indifference. Further off, a concierge leaned against a marble pillar, his posture slack, his eyes glued to a phone screen, while guests wandered past, ignored and unassisted. The air felt heavy, stale, and cold. Michael scanned the room, cataloging the failures, the flickering light fixtures, the dust gathering on the ornate moldings, and the general lack of purpose in the staff's movements. Every detail was a deliberate strike against the property's value. He felt a sharp, tightening sensation in his chest, not from anger, but from the cold realization of what was happening. This was not just poor service. It was a calculated, systematic dismantling of his investment. He stood in the center of the room, his tall frame casting a long shadow, watching the slow decay of his own property. The hotel was being bled dry from the inside, and he was the only witness to the crime. Eliza Thornton finally looked up. Her expression was tight, a thin line of practiced annoyance that barely masked her disdain. She did not blink. She did not offer a polite nod of recognition. Instead, she leaned back, creating a physical barrier between them. Her voice was flat, devoid of any professional warmth, and carried just enough volume to ensure the nearby staff could hear the dismissal. "Mr. Wells is unavailable," she stated, her words clipped and precise. "He is currently in a high-level meeting regarding the trade show logistics. He has no time for unscheduled visitors." She paused, her eyes flicking toward the lobby entrance, as if to suggest he was blocking the flow of traffic. I suggest you try the hotel 3 blocks down. They have vacancies and are better equipped to handle walk-ins. She tapped a single key, a final punctuating sound. Michael stood perfectly still. The coldness of her tone did not rattle him, it sharpened his focus. He watched the way her fingers gripped the edge of the desk. The rejection was not just a refusal, it was a test. He felt the familiar, quiet hum of defiance rising in his chest, a steady pulse of resolve. Michael did not move. He stood rooted to the marble floor, his presence filling the space between the desk and the lobby entrance. He reached down and gripped the handle of his suitcase, pulling it closer until it rested against his leg. The movement was slow, deliberate, and final. He felt the weight of the bag against his calf, a grounding sensation that mirrored his internal resolve. Eliza watched him, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, but he ignored her now. He was no longer a guest seeking service. He was a landlord reclaiming his territory. He scanned the lobby once more, his eyes lingering on the concierge who had stopped scrolling and was now watching him with a flicker of unease. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thud of the rain against the glass doors. Michael shifted his weight, his posture relaxed, but ready, like a player waiting for the ball to drop. He would not be intimidated. He turned his back to the desk, walked toward a leather armchair in the corner, and sat down. He was not leaving. He was waiting. From the corner of the lobby, the room looked different. The perspective shifted. He watched the staff move with a choreographed, hollow efficiency that felt rehearsed. The concierge was still leaning against the pillar, his focus entirely on the screen in his palm, oblivious to the guests. Michael tapped his fingers against the leather armrest, keeping his movements minimal, almost invisible. Then, he felt a gaze. He did not turn his head immediately. He scanned the room, his eyes moving past the bellhop and the empty check-in line, until they landed near the elevators. A boy, no older than 12, was lingering by the brass doors. The boy was not waiting for a room. He was watching the desk, then watching Michael, his eyes wide and unblinking. Michael held his position, his posture remaining still, but his mind began to process the possibilities. In a space where every adult was either complicit or distracted, the boy was a ghost. He needed eyes on the inside, and he had just found them. Michael did not rush the moment. He kept his hands folded, his posture relaxed, and his gaze fixed on a point just past the boy. He needed to be certain the boy was not merely a bystander. He shifted his attention, letting his eyes drift casually toward the elevators, then back to the boy, catching the boy's wide, unblinking stare. The boy did not look away. He stood perfectly still, his hands tucked into his pockets, his focus locked onto Michael with an intensity that betrayed his age. Michael waited for a flicker of movement from the staff, but the concierge remained buried in his phone, and the clerk was still occupied with her screen. The lobby was a stage, and they were the only two people who knew the play was rigged. Michael tilted his head just a fraction. He held the boy's gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then gave a single, sharp nod. The boy's expression did not change, but his chin dipped in a mirror of Michael's gesture. It was a silent, binding agreement. The power in the room had shifted. Michael was no longer isolated. The game had begun. Michael stood. The movement was fluid, deliberate, and carried the weight of a man who had already decided the outcome. He gripped the handle of his suitcase, the wheels clicking against the marble floor as he crossed the lobby. The sound echoed, cutting through the low hum of the ventilation system. He reached the desk and stopped, his presence forcing the air in the immediate vicinity to thicken. Eliza Thornton did not look up immediately. She tapped a final key, her fingers hovering over the board before she finally lifted her gaze. Her expression was a mask of practiced indifference. "Mr. Wells is unavailable," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "He is currently in a high-level meeting regarding the trade show logistics. I suggest you try the hotel 3 blocks down." Michael did not blink. He did not retreat. He leaned forward, placing his palms flat against the polished surface of the counter. His voice dropped, settling into a low, authoritative register. "I am not leaving, Eliza," he said, the words measured and heavy. "I will wait in the lobby until Mr. Wells finds time to speak with me." Michael turned his back on the desk, the sound of his footsteps rhythmic and heavy against the marble. He did not look back. He walked toward the corner of the lobby, his eyes scanning the space with the precision of a scout. The grand room was a shell of its former self. He saw the concierge leaning against a pillar, thumbing through a phone while ignoring a guest near the entrance. He saw a bellhop dragging a heavy cart over a frayed carpet, the fabric bunched and torn, a clear sign of neglect. Every detail was a piece of the same puzzle. He reached the leather armchair, a deep, worn seat that offered a clear view of the entire floor. He sat, sinking into the cushions, his frame casting a long, sharp shadow across the floor. He did not slouch. He sat upright, his hands resting on the armrests, his posture radiating a calm, predatory patience. From this vantage point, the lobby felt like a chessboard. He watched the flow of people, the way the staff avoided eye contact, and the deliberate silence that hung over the check-in area. He was no longer a guest waiting for a room. He was an owner watching his house fall apart, cataloging every failure. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen glowing against the dim light of the corner. He did not use the hotel Wi-Fi. He tapped the screen with rhythmic, precise movements, bypassing the official network entirely. To ensure his connection remained invisible to the staff, his thumb hovered over the encrypted messaging interface. He needed eyes on the internal logs, and he needed them now. He typed a single, direct command to his private security lead, his fingers moving with the speed of a man who had spent a lifetime making split-second decisions. "Check the internal logs for the last 48 hours, he typed. "Something is blocking reservations. Find out who authorized the system override." He hit send. The message vanished into the digital void, leaving no trace on the hotel servers. He locked the screen and set the phone face down on his knee. The lobby continued its slow, artificial decay around him, but the game had shifted. He was no longer just watching the rot. He was actively dismantling the mechanisms that allowed it to thrive. Michael kept his eyes on the lobby entrance, his hands folded over his phone. He felt a shift in the room's rhythm. A small figure moved from the elevator bank, weaving through the sparse furniture. It was the boy, Zach. He walked with a casual, practiced gait, eyes darting toward the front desk to ensure no staff were watching. He stopped a few feet from Michael's armchair, his gaze dropping to his own feet. He knelt, his fingers fumbling with his laces. It was a perfect cover. The lobby was vast and mostly empty, but the sound of the distant rain against the glass provided a layer of white noise. Zach leaned in, his head tilted as if concentrating on the knot. He did not look up. His voice was a thin, barely audible thread. He was close enough now that Michael could see the tension in the boy's jaw. Zach shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the lobby floor. The boy was nervous, but his intent was clear. Michael leaned back, his posture relaxed, his ears tuned to the boy's every word. Zach did not look up, his fingers still working the laces with frantic, repetitive motions. "They are lying, Mr. Jordan," he whispered, the words barely rising above the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass. "The rooms are not full. I have been watching the elevator logs. Nobody is going up to the upper floors." Michael remained still, his gaze fixed on the front desk where Eliza continued her performative typing. Zach leaned closer, his voice dropping another octave. "The manager told them to turn everyone away. He said the entire floor is blocked off for a private party tonight. A party for someone named Pike." The information hit the air between them, sharp and undeniable. Michael scanned the lobby, noting the concierge who had not checked in a single guest for over an hour. The boy was right. The vacancy was manufactured, a deliberate hollow-out. Zach pulled his hands back, his task finished, and stood up with a quick, nervous glance toward the desk. He did not wait for a response, turning and walking toward the elevators with a forced, casual stride. Michael sat in the silence, the weight of the revelation settling into his chest. The name hung in the air, a cold weight that anchored Michael to the leather chair, Vernon Pike. The name was not just a label, it was a signature of a long-standing, calculated betrayal. Michael felt the muscles in his jaw tighten, a familiar reaction to a direct challenge. He closed his eyes for a split second, replaying the acquisition documents in his mind. Pike had sold the hotel, but the man had never truly left. He had remained in the shadows, pulling the strings of the staff, orchestrating the decline of the property from within. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow, turning the lobby into a cage of deception. Every idle staff member, every empty room, and every dismissive glance from the front desk now had a single architect. This was not a business failure. It was a systematic dismantling of his legacy. Michael gripped the armrests of the chair, his knuckles turning white. Michael watched the lobby, his eyes tracing the path of the bellhop who had not moved a single bag in 20 minutes. The hotel was a ghost ship, steered by ghosts. He looked at the empty registration ledger on the desk, then back to the concierge, who was still staring at his phone. This was not a slump. This was a demolition. By keeping the occupancy artificially low, they were bleeding the valuation dry, ensuring the property would be worthless by the time he fully took the keys. It was a classic squeeze, a brutal financial maneuver designed to force a fire sale. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and scanned the restaurant entrance. A group of men sat near the back, their presence jarring against the quiet, sterile atmosphere. They were not guests, they were the architects of the decline. He felt the familiar, cold surge of adrenaline, the kind that preceded the final minutes of a championship game. The financial war was no longer a theory. It was a tangible, unfolding assault on his ownership. He was fighting to reclaim his house. The chair creaked as Michael pushed himself upright. He did not rush. He rose in a single, fluid motion that seemed to pull the very air of the lobby toward him. Standing at his full height, he cast a long, dark shadow that stretched across the polished marble floor, cutting through the dim, artificial light of the room. The concierge looked up from his phone, his eyes widening as he registered the change in the atmosphere. Michael ignored him. He ignored the bellhop. He turned his gaze toward the front desk, where Eliza Thornton was still typing, her rhythmic tapping suddenly faltering. He took one step, then another, his boots clicking against the stone with the weight of a gavel. The lobby now felt like a stage. He did not look for permission. He did not look for a path. He simply occupied the space, his presence, an undeniable fact. He walked toward the restaurant entrance, his stride rhythmic and purposeful. He was no longer a guest. He was the owner reclaiming his house. The restaurant entrance loomed ahead, the threshold between the sterile lobby and the source of the rot. Michael slowed his pace, his eyes shifting from the polished brass fixtures to the scene unfolding behind the glass. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and cheap ambition. A group of men sat huddled around a corner table, their movements jagged and aggressive, entirely out of place against the velvet-backed chairs and crystal glassware. They were not hotel guests. They were enforcers. Then, he saw him. Damon Wells sat at the center of the circle, his posture relaxed, his face twisted into a mocking laugh. He was surrounded by men with hard eyes and heavy shoulders, their rough demeanor clashing violently with the refined, high-end surroundings. Michael stopped, his boots silent on the plush carpet of the dining area. He watched them for a heartbeat, his jaw set, his gaze locking onto Wells. The contrast between the luxury setting and the criminal element was the final piece of the puzzle. The game was no longer being played in the shadows. The pieces locked into place with the cold precision of a deadbolt. The empty hallways, the dismissive staff, the fabricated reservations. It was not incompetence. It was a systematic, calculated dismantling of the hotel's value. Michael watched the men at the table, their rough hands resting on the fine linen, and the motive became clear. This was a squeeze play. They were driving the revenue into the dirt to force a fire sale valuation, all while using the prime location as a private playground for illicit business. Damon Wells was not just managing a hotel. He was gutting it from the inside out. acting as the architect of a bankruptcy that would leave Michael with nothing but a hollow shell. The realization hit with a physical weight, tightening his chest. He saw the pattern in the way the men ignored the service staff, the way they treated the space as their own private fortress. It was a coordinated effort to bankrupt the property. Every detail he had gathered: the blocked rooms, the staff's rehearsed lies, the presence of these thugs converged into a single, undeniable truth. The rot was deep, but it was contained. He was no longer looking at a business problem. He was looking at a theft in progress. The game had shifted to an offensive strike. Michael began to move. His first step was heavy, deliberate, and echoed against the marble floor with the finality of a gavel. He did not rush, yet his momentum was absolute. As he crossed the lobby, the ambient noise of the hotel began to bleed away. The concierge stopped scrolling through his phone, his thumb hovering mid-air, and the bellhop pulling the heavy cart froze in place, the wheels grinding to a sudden, jarring halt. Michael ignored them all. His eyes remained locked on the restaurant entrance, his gaze a steady, unblinking line of force. Each stride was rhythmic, measured, and perfectly timed, cutting through the stagnant air of the lobby like a blade. He felt the floor beneath him, the cold stone grounding his resolve. The air grew thinner as he approached the dining area, the silence in his wake deepening with every passing second. He was not merely walking, he was reclaiming space. Michael reached the edge of the carpet, his tall frame casting a long, dark shadow. The lobby was now entirely silent. The game had reached its terminal point. A familiar heat bloomed at the base of his neck, spreading outward with the rhythmic pulse of his own heartbeat. It was the same sensation that arrived in the final seconds of a tied game, when the arena noise vanished and the rim seemed to widen. Michael stood at the restaurant entrance, his hands unclenched at his sides, feeling the world around him sharpen into high-definition clarity. The ambient hum of the hotel, the distant clatter of silverware, the low murmur of the thugs, the ventilation drone all faded into a singular, muted backdrop. He did not rush the feeling. He leaned into it, drawing a slow, controlled breath that expanded his chest and locked his focus onto the man at the center of the table. Damon Wells was still laughing, his head tilted back, unaware that the atmosphere had shifted. Michael felt the tension in his muscles coil, a predatory readiness that replaced his earlier frustration. He was no longer a guest waiting for an audience. He was a competitor, reading the defense, identifying the gap, and preparing for the strike. Every nerve was calibrated, every movement calculated for maximum impact. The game was no longer theoretical. It was happening now. Michael took one final heavy step across the threshold. The transition from the lobby to the restaurant was not just a change in room, but a shift in jurisdiction. He stopped at the head of the table, his shadow falling directly across the plates and glasses. The laughter at the table died instantly, choked off by the sudden weight of his presence. He did not ask for permission to speak. He did not wait for an invitation to join. He pulled a chair out, with a sharp, metallic screech that cut through the silence, but he did not sit. Instead, he gripped the back of the chair, his knuckles white, and leaned forward. The men at the table shifted, their eyes darting toward the exit, but Michael held the space with a stillness that was more intimidating than any shout. He looked at the half-empty glasses, the scattered documents, and the forced casualness of the scene. He was no longer a visitor navigating a lobby. He was the owner reclaiming his property. He turned his gaze to Damon Wells, who had stopped mid-sentence, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. Michael did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He simply waited, his eyes tracking the flicker of hesitation in Wells's expression, until the man finally looked up. The power dynamic had inverted. The house was his again. Michael stood at the threshold of the restaurant, his presence acting like a physical barrier between the table and the rest of the hotel. He did not move, yet the room felt smaller. The air grew dense, heavy, with the silence he brought with him. He watched the men at the table. One of them shifted his weight, his chair scraping against the floor, but the sound was thin and nervous. They were no longer laughing. They were no longer drinking. They were watching him, their eyes darting between the exit and the man standing at the head of their table. Michael took a single, measured step forward. His stride was rhythmic, steady, and entirely unhurried. He stopped 3 feet from the table, his tall frame casting a shadow that swallowed the remnants of their meeting. The thugs exchanged glances, their bravado evaporating as they realized the man before them was not a guest, but the owner. He did not speak. He simply held his position, his gaze locked onto the space between the men, forcing them to acknowledge his arrival. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Michael did not move, his focus narrowing until the entire room seemed to exist only to frame the man sitting at the head of the table. Damon Wells, still holding a glass, felt the shift in the air. He turned his head slowly, his mouth still curved in the ghost of a dismissive smirk. Then, his eyes locked onto Michael. The smirk didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp contraction of his facial muscles. His glass stopped halfway to the table, his fingers tightening around the stem until his knuckles turned pale. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin sallow. He looked at the man standing over him, then back at the empty table, then back at Michael, as if searching for a way to deny the reality standing in front of him. His breath hitched, a short, sharp intake of air that was audible in the quiet. The arrogance that had defined his posture seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed stillness. He was no longer the man orchestrating a takeover. He was a man caught in the act. Michael watched the transformation, his own expression unreadable, his gaze pinning Wells to the chair. The recognition was complete. The mask of the manager had fallen, and beneath it, there was only the raw, frantic fear of a man who knew his game was over. Michael did not blink. He held his position, his feet planted firmly on the polished floor, his gaze fixed on the man trembling in the chair. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, a physical weight that seemed to press down on the tables and the men huddled around them. Slowly, with a deliberate rhythmic motion, Michael brought his hands up. He crossed them over his chest, locking his elbows into place. The movement was slow, measured, and final. It was the posture of a man who owned the ground he stood on. He leaned forward just an inch, his shoulders casting a wider shadow over the table. The men flanking Wells shifted, their chairs scraping against the marble, but they did not stand. They were paralyzed by the sheer stillness of the man before them. Michael tilted his head, his eyes never leaving Wells, who remained frozen, his hands still gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The air in the room felt thin, drained of oxygen by the intensity of the standoff. Michael did not speak, yet the gesture of his folded arms shouted a demand for an immediate accounting. He was a wall, an immovable object. The game had reached its absolute, silent zenith. Michael's voice cut through the stagnant air like a blade. It was low, steady, and devoid of any hesitation. "The meeting is over, Damon." He did not raise his volume, yet every word resonated against the marble walls. The effect was immediate. The men flanking the table flinched, their hands hovering near their jackets, but they did not rise. They looked at Michael, then at each other, and finally back at the floor. The authority Wells had projected evaporated. Michael took a single step forward, the sound of his heel clicking against the stone floor echoing like a gunshot. He did not look at the others. His focus remained locked on Wells. The manager's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Michael stood over him, his shadow stretching across the table, swallowing the remnants of the illicit gathering. The game had shifted, and the power had finally, irrevocably, changed hands. Michael did not break his gaze. He kept his eyes locked on Wells, then slowly turned his head to survey the vast, hollow expanse of the lobby behind him. The silence was absolute. He gestured toward the vacant reception desk and the rows of dark, unlit corridors. "Let us talk about why my hotel is empty." His voice carried a cold, sharp edge that seemed to vibrate against the marble pillars. The men surrounding the table stiffened. They looked at the empty lobby, then back at the floor, unable to meet his challenge. Michael took another step forward, his presence filling the space between the restaurant entrance and the table. He was no longer asking. He was demanding an account of the sabotage. The thugs shifted in their seats, the sound of fabric against leather loud in the stillness. They were no longer the aggressors. They were witnesses to a collapse. Michael stood motionless, his posture radiating a calm, terrifying certainty. He waited for a response, his silence acting as a physical barrier. Wells looked up, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the table edge. He had no answer. Michael stood over them, the undisputed center of the room. The silence in the lobby was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight. It pressed against the marble, the glass, and the people trapped within the space. Eliza Thornton stopped mid-keystroke, her fingers hovering over the plastic keys, her gaze fixed on the floor. The concierge, previously hidden behind his phone, stood upright, his device forgotten on the counter. A bellhop, caught near the elevators, let a brass keycard slip from his hand. It struck the marble floor with a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed through the vast, empty room. No one moved to retrieve it. Every eye in the lobby was drawn to the restaurant entrance, where Michael stood. The thugs at the table had ceased their posturing. Their shoulders slumped as if the air had been drained from their lungs. They looked at Wells, then at Michael, their faces drained of color. The power had shifted, and the realization was visible in the way they avoided eye contact. The hotel was no longer a playground for illicit deals. It was a space reclaimed. Michael remained perfectly still, his presence anchoring the entire room in the absolute quiet. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thrum of the rain against the hotel glass. Damon Wells reached up to adjust his tie, his fingers fumbling against the fabric. The movement was small, jerky, and entirely ineffective. He looked around the table, seeking support from the men who had been laughing only moments before. But they were staring at their plates, their bodies rigid. The air in the restaurant was thin, suffocating. Eliza Thornton remained behind the desk, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the marble floor. She did not reach for her keyboard. She did not look toward the elevators. The entire lobby had become a gallery of statues. Michael did not blink. He held his position, his presence acting as a gravitational pull that kept every person in the room anchored. The thugs, once emboldened by the promise of illicit gains, now looked small and exposed under the harsh lobby lights. The reality of the situation had settled over them like a shroud. They were no longer participants in a scheme. They were spectators to their own undoing. Every second that passed, without a word from Michael, deepened their paralysis. The game had not just shifted, it had been decisively won. Michael took a single, measured step into the restaurant. The sound of his heel striking the floor was the only signal needed. The men at the table stood in unison, their chairs scraping harshly against the wood, and retreated toward the side exit without a word. Wells remained, his hands trembling as he reached for his briefcase, but he did not dare look up. Michael walked past him, his gaze fixed on the front desk. He caught Eliza Thornton's eye. She reached for her keyboard, her movements frantic and precise, as if the hotel's survival depended on the speed of her typing. The concierge stood up, straightened his back, and began to organize the guest logs. The bellhop picked up the dropped keycard. The lobby, which had been a frozen monument to failure, began to pulse with activity again. Michael moved to the large glass window. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the glass, but the sound was muffled, distant. It was no longer a threat to the foundation. He turned back to the room, his presence no longer an intrusion, but the center of gravity. The Skyview Grand was open for business.